Hey again, how have you been doing? Hope everything's great. I do hope that you enjoy the course thus far, and let's move on to the next subject, which is one of the main rules of the attack. It's all about the time. Let's take a look at the first example and we'll see it more specifically. In this position it was white to play, and because the white's bishop on f4 has been attacked, white certainly decided to take there on e5, and now it is black to play. What do you think about it? Like, what kind of move would you play here? Well, pretty obviously black has to recapture, and he can either recapture by his queen or by the knight. And there is one common mistake that I see people make, is in situations like that, they just focus solely on their position, their pieces, and they think which move seems best for them. But it's always important to keep in mind the general picture. And if you just forget for a second about this bishop and just think about the position in a more general strategic terms, you may notice a couple of things. One of them is that white is a little bit behind in development. He still has his bishop on f1 undeveloped, so white still needs to take time to develop that bishop. Also, right now black is a pawn up, and therefore it will probably take time for white to capture that pawn back, if he can, which is another move that he will have to spend before developing his bishop, or instead of development. Anyway, it means that black is ahead in development, which may give you an idea that you may wish to start an attack, and you need to do this quickly. Imagine black decided to just take on e5 with a queen, which may seem like the most natural choice to just protect that weak pawn on e4. Say black recaptures. Now white has the time to develop the bishop. For instance, he can play bishop g2, attacking that pawn on e4. Black would need to protect it now somehow, maybe play rook e8, and white can continue with something like rook d4 to keep attacking that pawn, and everything is just okay for white. Let's take a few steps back and see what could have black done instead. In the actual game, black took with the knight. His idea is to give up the pawn, because white can now capture it, but instead he played rook to d8, and he tries to bring his pieces into the game as quickly as possible, trying to take advantage of the white's underdeveloped position. Now white is somewhat in trouble, because he needs to develop the bishop, but at the same time black is also threatening that pawn on f2. For instance, if white plays something like bishop e2, then even though it may seem like the black's queen from f6 needs to protect the knight, but in fact he can take on f2 because it would also attack the bishop, and this way black wins the pawn. Therefore, this is an unfavorable variation for white, and instead white decided to save the pawn. So he first exchanged the rooks and then played pawn to f4. And certainly white hopes for the black's knight to go away, then white would develop his light-squared bishop and have an approximately equal position. Is there anything better that black can play here? So again, that's the factor of time in the attack, which says that when you're attacking, you should try doing it quickly before your opponent has the time to regroup, to bring up more pieces into the defense, or to finalize his development, or do anything like that. That's why, while attacking, always ask yourself, how can I attack now? How can I force my opponent to defend instead of doing something that he wants? For example, in this position, are there any attacking moves that black can play? If you think this way, you may find the move queen d6. Now black is threatening to go forward with the queen either to d1 or maybe to d2 and create some problems for the white's king. Therefore, white has no time to develop his bishop. He has to protect his king. He played queen c2, and now black moved the knight back, because in this case it also creates the threat of knight b4, which would additionally attack the queen and the pawn on a2, and therefore it's not just to retreat, it also somewhat prepares an attack. White played bishop c4, trying to also finalize his development, and black once again kept attacking by playing knight to a5. Right now black wants to grab that bishop, and then this would deflect the white's queen, which would have to recapture, and after that the black's queen can go inside with queen to d2 and make some bad work there, bad for white. So white played bishop e2 to save the bishop, and black found another attacking move, queen e6, and this time it's a double attack to the white's pawn on e3 and to the pawn on a2. And there is no way for white to protect both of these pawns simultaneously, therefore white would lose one of them, and within several next moves white lost the game as well. As usual, if you want to see the entire game, you may go to the supplementary materials, and there you can find all these games like in full, in PGN format. Right now we'll stop here because black already got a decisive advantage here at this point. And it was just a nice illustration of this rule that you shouldn't just think about like which move is natural for me to play. Evaluate the general situation, and if you think that there are some reasons for you to believe that you can start attacking, then you may need to rush into the attack and do it as quickly as possible. Here's another example, the game between Gonciarowski and Alokhin, who was the third world chess champion. White played pawn to e4, e5, bishop c4, knight f6, so far everything's pretty standard, d3, c6, and queen e2. And that's already the first move, which is like the second best option. In an opening we need to develop minor pieces first, now the queen. Black played bishop e7, here white played pawn to f4. And once again, it may seem like an attacking move, and a lot of amateur players love playing like that, but in reality, once again, white is ignoring development of his minor pieces, which is a mistake. And therefore, whenever you play your game and you see that your opponent makes wrong moves or second best moves, it means that you should not be, scared about his attacking attempts. Quite the contrary, you need to try to find a way to rush into the attack and to make your opponent regret about his mistakes. That's why black played d5, attacking the bishop. He wants to start counter-attacking. White capture the pawn, and right now, if black would recapture somewhere here, with, let's say, pawn takes d5, white can go bishop b5 check, and then possibly take the pawn on e5. So instead, black decided to take that pawn on f4. By the way, notice that it is actually a pawn sacrifice, because instead of just taking the pawn on f4, white can now take the pawn here, and then take back the pawn on f4. And at this position, white is a pawn up. However, black gained some temples for development of his pieces, and therefore, since now he had a development, just like we discussed earlier, now he can start playing some attacking moves right away. For instance, he can go knight d4, attacking the queen and the pawn, and that's already somewhat a little bit unpleasant for white. And later on, black will certainly castle, place his rook on e8, and will try attacking white there. And that didn't seem like a very good thing for white, therefore in the real game, white just took the pawn on f4. And black castled. Once again, you may notice that instead of collecting the pawn back, black tries to always just finalize his development first and foremost. White played knight to d2. At this point, black finally recaptured the pawn because anyway he needs to develop the knight somehow. White played bishop b3. Here there was another interesting moment. Black certainly could have played knight c6, and that's definitely a normal option. But when you are ahead in development, when you wish to attack, you need to try to create threats as soon as you can. And for that single reason, knight c6, even though a perfectly fine move, may not be the best. If you ask yourself, how can I attack right away? You will come to some other moves that you may consider. For instance, bishop g4, attacking the queen. One interesting option. Another one was played by Alokhin. He played pawn to a5, threatening to capture the bishop after a4. White played pawn to c3, but black still can push the bishop away. And after bishop retreated back, black continued with pawn to a3, destroying the white's pawn structure. Whenever you can create some weaknesses in the opponent's pawn structure, you create some targets for your attack in the future, and therefore it's a great thing to do. White replied pawn to b3. Now, how can black attack here? Again, bishop g4 is still an option. Another one is rook to e8, which creates a threat of discovered attack, which actually happened on the next move because it's hard for white to stop it anyway. He needs to remove either his queen or the king from this dangerous line, which he did by castling queenside, but now black can make that discovered attack anyway, and he played bishop to b4, which is an attack of the queen, but at the same time black wants to grab the pawn. White retreated with the queen, black captured the pawn, and certainly that's a very great thing for black, as you can see that the bishop is now close to the white's king, and it does create some possibilities for black in the future. White played bishop g5, trying to pin the knight. Here black continued developing his piece. He played knight to c6, and now again it's not just a development because this knight is really ready to take part into the attack. Attack the bishop, attack the pawn, and create some serious threats to white. White played knight to f3. Finally he continued his development, rather finalized his development, but of course the cost for that was too high. He had to expose his king, weaken his position on the queen side, create a bunch of weaknesses, and therefore black has strong potential for the attack. And at this point, it was probably the easiest thing for black just to play knight b4 and to start its very strong attack right away. But instead, Alokhin found an interesting tactical trick which he decided to play, and it's a quite fun variation to watch, so let's see what happened in the game. He played d4, and his idea we can notice on the next move after white played rook to e1. Black played bishop b2 check, king b1, and then all of a sudden knight to d5. That's been the idea behind the move pawn to d4. It seems like black is sacrificing the queen, but in reality he has prepared the move knight to c3 checkmate. And there is actually no way for white to stop that anyway. White took that rook on e8, black recaptured. How can white stop knight c3 checkmate now? He played knight e4, but black certainly has the way to continue his attack. Can you see the winning continuation? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Black can eliminate the defender of the c3 square by playing queen takes e4. And he insists on playing knight to c3 checkmate. White once again tried to protect that square by playing bishop to d2, and here Alokhin played another fun move, queen e3. Black still noticed that white can't really move that bishop away from d2 due to this knight to c3 checkmate threat, and therefore he really made another move forward with his queen, creating some stronger pressure on the white's position. White played rook to e1. And it just really shows how important it is to always be careful in chess, because black is certainly like almost won the game already, and everything is in black's favor. But if black would just make one careless move, queen takes f2, just thinking that white is desperate and he lost his queen, there would be this back rank checkmate. And annoying losses like that happen all the time, especially in the internet blitz games. And that's why I always recommend that you never forget to make the anti-blunder check. Before playing your move on the board, the one that you intend to play, ask yourself, are there any attacking moves that my opponent can play? This just helps you to prevent these kind of disastrous results that sometimes we all face, unfortunately. Alokhin certainly noticed that stuff, and he just plays bishop to f5. Another cool move. He just continues developing his pieces despite of the fact that his queen is under the attack, because he knows that he's going to checkmate white very soon. White captured the queen, black recaptured, the queen being attacked, it was retreated, black took an d2, and once again it renews the threat of knight c3 checkmate. So white played bishop to d1, trying to prepare this escape square for the king. Black covered that square as well, and on the next move he finally delivered that beautiful checkmate with knight to c3. Great game by Alokhin, but even more so, it's a great example of the fact that whenever you noticed in an opening or in any stage of the game that your opponent plays second best moves or not the something that seems to be a little bit weird or a little bit wrong to you, always think for ways to punish your opponent for that mistake. The way to do this is to start attacking. Try to create threats so that your opponent has no time to cover his position and to eliminate the negative consequences of the mistakes that he made. Doing so will help you win brilliant games just like this. And there we go with the final game of this lesson between Conquest and Hrachik, the two grandmasters. It is white to play. How do you think about this position? How would you play here as white? Imagine if that's your game. Like, what are the moves that seem to be the most natural to you here? We can see that white has finalized the development already, while black still needs to take his time to play bishop to b7, and ideally speaking also rook to c8 to bring all of his pieces into play, while white has already developed all of his pieces. Therefore, it is definitely the time for white to begin his attack. When you want to start attacking, you need to focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and ask yourself, how can you play your pieces or pawns there and take or attack something? If you ask yourself this question, how can you move forward to the opponent's half of the board, you will easily find the move pawn to d5. It attacks the knight, and black can't recapture because the pawn is pinned. Black played knight to a5. In this position, white noticed that if he would just take there on e6, it doesn't give too much to white because black can simply recapture, and at the same time there is a little bit of an unpleasant opposition of the black's rook versus the white's bishop and queen. Therefore, white decided to remove the queen from this line, and he played queen b1. It's not the only move that white could have played here, of course, but it's one of the decent options. At the same time, white is also creating this battery, queen plus bishop, that starts pressuring black's king side. Black played queen d6. He's also doing the same thing, removing the queen from the pin. And once again, white asked himself, how can I attack here? If you think about this, what kind of moves can you find here? There are a number of them, like knight to b5 attacking the queen, knight to g5 attacking the pawn on h7, maybe pawn takes e6, because it's the forcing move. So these are the main moves that you need to consider. Maybe knight e4 as well. It's not on the black side of the board, but it's still a forcing move. Again, as you can see, when you know the right principles for finding attacking moves, everything becomes very easy for you. You don't have to think about all the potential moves that white can play because you know what to focus on. In the game, white chosen to play knight to g5, attacking the pawn on h7 because it's now attacked by the white's knight, the bishop, and the queen. Black played g6, and here white found that he can finally take on e6 and start destroying the black's position. Black recaptured on d3. Maybe he was hoping to win the piece, but there was a problem for black here that white can push his pawn forward to e7, and there is no easy way for black to stop that pawn. Black can't just remove the rook to e8 because the rook needs to keep protecting the queen, otherwise it will simply be captured. In case black wants to trade off the queens in between and then remove the rook, white certainly doesn't have to recapture right away. He can first grab that rook on d8 with check, and only then capture back the queen, which would just give white significant material advantage. So that's also not an option for black. That's why black just played rook to d7. And now, certainly white can play pawn to e8 right away, trying to promote the new queen, but this pawn will be taken by the knight. So white first decided to eliminate the knight, and he played knight to d5, hoping to eliminate the knight from f6 and then just promote a whole new queen. At the same time, the black's queen on d3 is still hanging, therefore black is already in a big trouble. He played rook takes d5, trying to somehow cope with all of his problems that he's facing. White continued pawn to e8, black recaptured, white captured with the rook, black played king g7, and now white took the rook back. Black recaptured the pawn. I don't analyze all the sidelines here, there are many, but you can just notice the general idea, and the general idea is that white is trying to attack by his every move. Since the time he noticed that he's ahead in development, that he completed his development while black doesn't, he realized that it's time to rush into the attack, and therefore, with his every move, he's trying to create certain problem for black. Even right now, black has just attacked the knight on g5, but white doesn't want to simply retreat with the knight, he wants to keep attacking. If white would just retreat the knight, black would have the time to move his bishop somewhere, maybe to b7. At the same time, that would also create the checkmating threat, and would finalize the development, and it will become not easy for white. Therefore, white does not want that. White doesn't want to give any free time to black. And so he plays rook b5, protecting the knight and at the same time attacking the queen. The queen has to go back, and here white once again asks himself, how can I attack here? And he felt that he can make check queen to a1. Black played pawn to f6, white played knight e4, attacking the queen. The queen retreated to c6, and at this point white just took the pawn on f6. Again, white is always looking for forcing moves, and he wants to eliminate the pawn cover of the black's king so that he can start attacking right away. What can black do here? In case he takes that knight on f6, it really doesn't work because white can play rook to e7 check, and on the next move to grab the queen. Black's queen cannot take the rook because it's pinned. There is the black's king behind. Desperation, black is losing, and in case black tries taking another piece of white, the rook on b5, here there's a beautiful checkmate white can deliver, starting with knight to g8, and it's a check from the white's queen. The king has to go to f7, the only square, and then the white's queen joins the party, plays queen to f6 check, king e8 is forced, and then queen e7 checkmate. And that's a brilliant continuation, a brilliant finish of this game where white just noticed that black is underdeveloped and noticed that black never had the time to finalize his development because white was attacking by his every move. And it's a very powerful strategy. The black player is a strong grandmaster, 2600 rated, but you can see that he lost this game without finalizing his development even, just because the white's attack was so strong and most importantly, so quick.